One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and in this episode of Follow the Money, we'll be listening back to an interview I did as part of a series of webinars hosted by the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre as part of Nordic Talks. Nordic Talks brings together experts to discuss global challenges with a focus on Nordic policy. Australia has all the ingredients for a green industrial revolution: abundant rare minerals, plentiful wind and sun, manufacturing capabilities, while Sweden is a global leader in green industry practices and production. But how does the clean energy transition impact upon First Nations communities, and how can they participate in it? How can Sweden and Australia do better at balancing the competing interests between the so-called green gold rush and the interests of First Nations communities? We spoke with Jenny Karlsson, CEO and Senior Legal Advisor at the National Association of Sámi in Sweden, Chris Croker, Managing Director of Impact Investment Partners and First Nations Clean Energy Network Steering Group member, as well as Rod Campbell, Research Director at the Australia Institute. Jenny, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Sweden. If I can begin with you, Sámi communities are obviously experiencing climate change impacts already. How is global warming impacting on Sámi communities and your way of life in Sweden?
Well, climate change has been here for a while, and our member, mainly reindeer herders, are nomadic people and mitigate with reindeers as a traditional livelihood and move from mountain to coast. And living in the Arctic, which Sámi are located in, we have seen for at least 10 years now a rapidly speeding warming, which affects mainly, at first, of course, the pasture land and the possibility for the reindeers to get the food, especially during winter time. Reindeers are adapted to living in the Arctic and mainly living on lichen during winter time. And what we see by climate change is changing on weather conditions. There have always been changing in weather, but now we have extreme changes on a daily basis, and a lot of ice are on the pasture land, which means that the reindeers can't dig for lichen, for example. They are very good at digging. They can dig for like 1.5 meters of snow, but if the ground is locked by ice, they're not able to gain the food. And dealing with that, and also dealing with the fact that you have a lot of industries and a lot of infrastructures that are on pasture land, you have a puzzle and you have to navigate it. So we're facing quite a lot of different issues, but mainly is the weather and how it's affecting on a daily basis, together with, of course, every other impact from others, and a lot of predatory animals. For example, we have an increasing, which is good, looking into diversity. Although when it's the primary feeding for predatory animals, for example, is reindeer in the northern part of Sweden, and the number of estimated loss we have for predatory animals is about 85,000 a year, which means that we're not able to slaughter them for outcome, for example, because the reindeer herders are supposed to live on reindeer herding and to sale of very good climate friendly meat. But we can see when you have a lot of industry on the ground, a lot of the predatory animals area habitat is also losing. We are pushed together. So this is it's a puzzle of everything. So and a paradox that when we talk about trying to save, as we're going to talk about today, with clean energy or clean, this is a paradox for us, because every windmill farm and any mine that is located on reindeer husbandry land, actually taking our land is more or less impacting us to have more. Our carbon print will be bigger because we need to use more transport, more snowmobiles, more helicopters in order to herd reindeer. So this is quite challenging.
Yeah, so you've got multiple impacts there, not only from extreme weather, but also encroaching development and increasing industry. We might come back to dig in a little deeper to some of those issues. But Chris Croker, I know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are often on the front lines of climate change as well. I just wonder, before we get into that though, if you could tell us a little bit about the First Nations Clean Energy Network and the kind of work that you do.
Yes, definitely. I'd just like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the country where I'm talking from. I'm in Naarm, down in Melbourne. So I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. My family is actually from the Central Desert, so I'm actually a long way from home. But yeah, the First Nations Clean Energy Network, it's of course in Australia and around the world, there's a lot of developments in wind, solar, other types of clean energy developments, and that's been happening for a while now. We've seen this transition take place, and actually, if anything, it's only ramping up. With all forecasts, it's going to be growing. So what we did, a few Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people that were working in this space, and also seeing firsthand some of the issues with climate change and energy affordability and access for our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities, thought, well, there must be a better way. Let's get together and bring a bit of cultural knowledge, bit of science, and bit of political pressure to actually really put in place a bit of a changing mechanism. Basically, the First Nations Clean Energy Network has been set up by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to, as I said, to really bring some cultural knowledge, some experience with climate change and lobbying, and combining that with academic research and a bit of science to actually, how do we mobilise and educate ourselves to actually be active participants in this energy revolution that we're seeing. So we've set up the Clean Energy Network under three pillars: a community focus, a policy reform lens, and the industry partnerships. And it's all pretty self-explanatory, but community is basically about focusing on removing the barriers for our people in having access to secure, cheaper, cleaner energy, and supporting our representative groups and land councils and community organisations to be better equipped, so they're ready and able to engage in and benefit from this revolution. Because of course we want this revolution to happen, but also we want it to be a just transition as well. So that's required a lot of work around building the capacity of First Nations communities and people within Australia, so they can really advocate and seize the opportunity in front of them, and also to really be actively participating with industry and investors in all of these opportunities. so we can actually influence and shape this energy transformation that we have underway in Australia. The other lens, of course, is the policy reform. As with everywhere, there's a lot of legislation and government policy and regulations that control and stipulate how projects or new infrastructures formed and built and where it's placed. So there's a lot of work required on the policy reform side, and basically really work to change the way that renewables are being delivered to First Nations households, whether that's from my country in the Central Desert or where I am down in the metro regions, like down in Naarm. We all have all these issues that actually requires some policy reform. And one of the classic examples is around residential solar. So in Australia, it's actually against most state-based legislations to install residential solar, so solar panel on rooftops, on public housing. And a lot of our families are in welfare, public housing, Aboriginal housing. So that's a straight requirement for actual regulatory change. But then also working with governments, whether they're at the state, territory or federal level, to actually remove some of those barriers. We can't do this alone, of course. So the third pillar that we're working towards is around industry partnerships. So working closely with some of the industry, clean energy industry peak bodies, such as in Australia, the Clean Energy Council. There are a couple of others, to really influence, to really get them to take up the baton around better practices with working with First Nations communities and how they go about engaging and gaining consent from the traditional owners or Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities, and really have this benefit sharing lens when we come to this energy revolution.
And Chris, before we I think, get into some of the details of that work that you engage in, and before we go back to Jenny, obviously Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are in very different have very different country to Sámi communities. It's quite different to the Arctic Circle here down under. But if you could just take us through, what are some of the climate impacts felt by your communities? It's
actually, those of us in Australia, we know even in the last 12 months, we've had these really massively extreme weather events. Even at the moment, we've got flooding across most of the Gulf country, up in Queensland and the border with the Northern Territory. Massive amount of flooding. Highest flood levels of these rivers ever recorded. We've had massive flooding across in Western Australia in the Kimberley just a little over 6 weeks ago. And then, of course, thinking back to just before Christmas, we had massive flooding. I know some of the communities in New South Wales experienced 1 in 5,000 year floods 3 times in the 1 year. Separate flooding events. So massive amount of, additional rain and flooding, but that's with really this chaotic weather and patterns. But then, of course, thinking back just a couple of years, or the year before that, we've had massive droughts as well, which led to these 2019 wild bushfire events that basically decimated areas of Victoria, New South Wales into Queensland. So those are really extreme events, but they are happening, and I think they're happening. They're more extreme. They may be more frequent than they used to be. And then we're, fronted with some of these really practical things, in the Central Desert. I remember having this conversation with one of our research organisations in Australia, the CSIRO, and, they've done extensive modelling around the climate effects and the predicted rising temperatures and that. And it's forecast that I think in the Northern Territory, the number of days above 35 will double, going from about 30 to 40 to, over 80 in the next 5 years. And then above 40 days, and I don't know whether, above 40 degrees is, I'm from the Northern Territory. I don't say it's hot. I say it's warm. But it's it's really hard, and it impacts everything. It impacts, even, businesses. People struggle to work out on side. Our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander housing that we live in these remote communities, they're not really energy efficient. They don't keep the heat out. It's being felt, and even it impacts everything. These rising extreme temperatures. Kids can't play sports anymore, out in the sun because it's literally too hot.
Yeah.
So we're actually having this, change in lifestyle as well. Before, I grew up and, playing a lot of sports and being out on country. That's really difficult. I was actually visiting an Aboriginal community just a couple of weeks in my line of work, and one of the things that we were sitting around the campfire talking about, it's actually similar to the Sámi example, is actually affecting the wildlife as well. One of the things that we see is actually the number of kangaroos, or malu as we would call it in our language. It's actually fallen away quite a lot. And so whereas, eating kangaroo would have been a part of our traditional diet, and even in this modern age, you'll still supplement what you buy from Karlsson and Woolworths with, a bit of bush food. And but yeah, the number of kangaroos have basically disappeared. And whether that's to do with, rise of agriculture or the rising temperatures, it's definitely coming from somewhere.
Jenny, if I can come back to you, Chris has talked about there how First Nations communities in Australia are really trying to make sure they're engaged and part of the consultation and participating actively in the clean energy transition. And you were talking there about the fact that Sámi communities in Sweden and perhaps elsewhere across the Arctic aren't necessarily getting that free, prior and informed consent like Chris was talking about, and that there's still a lot of pressure on Sámi country, areas that you normally would use for reindeer herding, under pressure not only from extractive industries but also potentially green industries coming through as well. Can you just tell us a little bit about those pressures and the conflict or the lack of balance with the interests of the Sámi community?
Well, at first, I think one of the big differences between the countries of Australia and in the Nordic or Sweden especially is that we have different legal system. We have you have common law, which means that you have not necessarily that First Nations in Aboriginals in country has it better in Australia, but the legislation in Sweden is different, which means that we're not. It's not in the. We not have any consultation process that is directly towards us as a Sámi indigenous that engage us. We did have one legal act that a consultation act that was began last year, and it was like 50 years of struggle in order to get that legal act on place. But the government has made sure that in this framework, FPIC is not within the law. The government's statement, actually, when it comes to FPIC, is that FPIC is not a human right. It's more or less a process. So today we're engaged when you can talk about free, informed, invest. And of course, the big issue in Sweden is when it comes to consent. And we do have a lot of environmental law when it comes to mining, especially quite hard ones in order to start a mining in Sweden. But it still doesn't involve the Sámi or the reindeer herding community. So this is a negotiation with the companies, are more or less depending on the Sámi to take active part with their own capacity. They're reindeer herders. They don't have the economic resources to be a part. It's very unequal when you have a big mining company, a big state-owned mining company with 10 lawyers at the table. You have engineering, you have whatever. And on the other side on the table, at best, you have one lawyer. Others, you could have 2 or 3 reindeer herders, which are very good at traditional knowledge and describing the impacts on land. But there is a conflict in Sweden because mainly all of the natural resources, such as mining, such as forestry, such as water turbines, are located on Sámi land. And of course, there's a conflict of interest here because we need to give up land from the reindeer, the traditional livelihood for us, but we're not getting anything back. But as an elder said to me, the reindeer can't eat money, can't eat iron, can't eat stone. So this is more or less, and what we're facing here is actually when we believe that the process of this green transition that everybody talks about, and we are fully aware of it's necessary, but it's going so rapidly that people doesn't really think what it means. So for us, it's more or less, we suggest to green transition, but not to the cost of biodiversity, human rights, and indigenous rights. A green transition needs to be with respect for those rights. And I think one of the biggest problem is for us is that the government and the companies are expecting us to participate and compete in this market-based economy that we all live in. But what we are actually fighting for is our basic need: food, shelter, safety, and that this is fundamental human rights as well. And there's not only a conflict about the land, it's also a conflict between Western way of looking at the future and the history. Sweden has a colonial history, as well as a lot of countries that have indigenous on their land. So this is a conflict of development and how to develop, but also a conflict of how to look on nature for us that lives with nature, on nature, and depending on to have that nature for 7 generations on. So of course this is a great conflict, and the government in Sweden are struggling more or less to try to solve it for the economy, not for the indigenous rights in Sweden.
I'm sure that sounds familiar to you as well, Chris. But before I come back to you, Rod, I did want to ask you, obviously, Australia has a huge history with some of those difficulties that Jenny is talking about with our extractive industries and how they treat the land. I'm not sure that our environment code is maybe as good as Sweden's when it comes up to opening new mines. But in terms of climate change impacts and extractive industries in Australia, Rod, could you just give people a picture of what that looks like? Are we winding down our extractive industries and mining, or going the other way?
Oh, we're certainly not winding them down. And in fact, we're not even winding down our fossil fuel projects. We've got 116 new ones in the pipeline that are just looking for finance and approvals. So no, we're certainly not looking to wind down. And I think we're here to talk about energy transition. There's certainly going to be different mining projects and different energy projects going forward. And I guess the thing that I really hope is that some of those projects and the governance around them can learn from some of the mistakes of the past. And I was just looking up one of the first projects I did with the Australia Institute. Actually, I'm an economist, and I was working with some local groups on a coal mining court case. And I was interested in what Jenny had to say, that a lot of the time it feels like it's one Sámi lawyer one lawyer for the Sámi representatives against a big mining company. In Australia, it's not just the community or Indigenous group against the mining company. It's usually the community or the Indigenous group against the government and the mining company. And that's certainly been the case here. But I can read out exactly how Aboriginal heritage impacts were described in this big court case that I did with Richard Dennis earlier, at least the economics of it, where the mines economist wrote, up to 114 individual Aboriginal heritage sites will be potentially destroyed by this coal mine. The majority of these are isolated artefacts of low significance. However, 2 grinding groove sites and 3 scar tree sites are of high conservation significance. Our study found that the community have placed non-use values on Aboriginal sites. We estimate them at $34 million per impacted site. That's the bad news. The good news was we were going to dig up $2 billion worth of coal. So the $150 million worth of value that Rio Tinto apparently put on Aboriginal heritage sites was easily outweighed by the coal we dug up, and everyone was going to be happy. And I guess that's an example of one thing that I hope as we do have this transition to different kinds of energy projects, that things can be done differently. And I hope government departments stop accepting this kind of nonsense about how economists might value Aboriginal heritage, and start actually doing their jobs and evaluating some of these projects in line with the community interest and in line with existing laws. I mean, I can think of a whole lot of ways that we could change laws and change institutional arrangements to make this transition better, but I think we could probably start with baby steps of actually using our existing processes properly, having those laws actually enforced and respected by governments and government agencies as they are. And, I think that'd be a hell of a good start.
Yeah, Chris, if I can come back to you next. Obviously, we've seen other examples of extractive industries and mining in particular having huge and devastating consequences for Aboriginal heritage and land and country in the past. So is the First Nations Clean Energy Network about, as Rod said, trying to learn some of those lessons and not make the same mistakes as the mining industry has in the past, where communities get a very paltry benefit or aren't being consulted in projects, rather that you're trying to be in it from the beginning and leading it and shaping it? Is that the idea? Yeah, pretty much, definitely. And I'd like to acknowledge that I should declare that I'm a former mining engineer, one of Australia's only Aboriginal mining engineers. But yeah, definitely in the past, there's been a really bad relationship with mining, extractive industries and Aboriginal and even the Islander communities, where basically, there was no qualms given to, moving Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders off their land, destroying artifacts, destroying heritage sites. That was the way. That did happen. What we've seen recently, though, with the rise in the Mabo decision and the native title rights, we've kind of have had First Nations groups in Australia actually at least have some rights to have a say over activity on their traditional land, which hasn't always worked in our favour to protect our interests and ensure that we're at least having a say. But in most cases recently, at least our voice is getting heard, whereas previously our voice wasn't even heard, which then of course development occurred unchecked. And really was encouraged by industry and governments, yeah. I was going to ask if you could tell us a little bit about some of the projects specifically that you're working on. I'm thinking of the Borroloola microgrid project. What are some of those things that you're involved in trying to push ahead with? Yeah, definitely. So I was just getting to, acknowledging that extractive industries have had a really bad relationship with First Nations people in Australia. It has kind of improved over the last few years,
But actually now we've got this new industry coming on and looking to develop projects on our traditional land, but not really being bound by some of the same requirements as even the mining industry has. A lot of course, clean energy is a type of electricity, so it can be considered an essential. It is considered an essential service. So there's actually provisions to the Native Title Acts across Australia that means that actually the right to negotiate is actually weakened as well. So what we're looking to do is actually learn from the not so good lessons from the extractive industries, encourage the clean energy industries to do better than extractive, and also at the same time make sure that we as community, we're actually empowering ourselves so we actually can be in control and actually guide these developments. So we have many examples underway currently. So one that you mentioned was up in the Northern Territory at a really remote community, the Baralula community that's up near the Gulf, not far from where I mentioned all that flooding is occurring. There, the electricity for the whole town, and it's not just an Aboriginal town. So there's industry, there's non-Aboriginal people that live in town as well. There's also a huge mine just down the road that has a checkered relationship with the traditional owners. That town, Baralula, currently, it requires over 1 million litres of diesel to power the diesel generator to supply electricity per year. So, of course, that's actually having a huge effect on carbon dioxide produced and, not really doing our part to address these climate change drivers. So the community's actually, said, well, we actually want to play our role in ensuring that we're, having a say, we're driving this clean energy development, but also they're really concerned about some of these other issues that can be solved through cheaper, lower cost power as well, actually around energy affordability for households and also energy reliability. I could get into that quite a lot of reasons why that's an issue, but trust me, it is an issue. Australia is a very rich, well-developed country, but actually most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are very marginalised and not part of this rich world that we, many of Australians take for granted. So the Baralula community, working in partnerships with a few community groups in my day job at Impact Investment Partners, we've been working with the community as well, but basically the community trying to develop a proactive solution and actually really guiding the change from a diesel generator across to a solar generation source, and actually look to really displace all the polluting diesel, but at the same time actually have some mechanisms in place to actually ensure greater energy affordability for local households. And that's actually there's a few cases of that happening, in most states nowadays, and all on the back of First Nations people, individuals and community organizations actually just starting to get on that journey, educating, what does a wind turbine look like? What does it do? What are the critical components? How is it built? How is it maintained? Same for solar, and what these systems are built, what are the other infrastructure required? The power lines, the transformers, all of the other kit and caboodle that goes with it, actually educating ourselves. And a part of it is actually also then trying to actually skill up locally so that we have a workforce that can actually, directly be involved in building these projects as well, and then also owning them.
But I will go to questions from the audience now. The first one I've got is from Kate Crawford, and Jenny, I think this one will be for you. She has said, how can we get governments to recognise the value of caring for land and seeing it as perhaps more than just money? Is it about caring about heritage or longer-term preservation? You've talked about biodiversity, for example. What do you think is the key to getting government to recognise the value of caring for Sámi country?
Well, I think one key is to recognise traditional knowledge as a resource, such as academic knowledge as well. But also, I think you can see when you look in the world in general today, you can see a shifting of minds in order to that people, especially younger people, want a different way of living. So I think this is talking and actually try to get the government or the specialist that works within the government system to listen, because as in our countries, we can say that we did see changing coming 25 years before a lot of the academic researchers. We did see signs in nature, and we have met a lot of other Indigenous sisters and brothers around the world. We went to Australia 3 years ago and visited. We have a great film, and I will send it for you, and you can that we made with during our visit. So I think it's talking, showing, and at the bitter end is actually demand that they listen. In Sweden, for example, we can see that during the last 2 weeks we have had a lot of activism, because the governments in Sámi, both in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, are rapidly speeding up this process, being on this green transition. So I think talking, and I think even though we doesn't have time, we do need to take time in order should not do the same mistake as we have done before, rushing into something that might not be green in the end. We don't know if we go very fast. For example, in Sweden, if you build a mine in Sweden, you need a lot of energy, and for that energy, you need to clear cut a lot of forest, and you have to build new roads, and you do a lot of impact. So I think to face down a little bit, and even though we doesn't have the time, but don't rush into every project. Choose the wisest project that will give most of it in the transition. But also, I think from our perspective, I had been glad if I could share with you that the dialogue with the government is moving forward. But actually, we have, as a lot of our sisters and brothers around the world, we have to go to court in order to get our rights recognized and respected. Hopefully we don't need that. Hopefully we can start this dialogue, but and hopefully I doesn't really got a question again from one of the Swedish biggest mining company that actually asked me during a negotiation, what's the cost of the community's consent? We're dealing with people's lives, and I think that's one thing we need to understand.
Can I just sort of ask a off-the-script follow-up question? I think Kate's question, as was originally phrased, was about how to get governments to see the value in looking after land, or promote the value of looking after land. And the approach of the Australian government recently has been to try and develop markets for biodiversity and to sell biodiversity credits, a little bit similar to carbon credits and carbon offsets. A path that I personally think is completely disastrous. But have Nordic governments gone down this same idea of trying to marketize the biodiversity or sort of natural health of parcels of land?
Well, we haven't, but we have different systems. We do have a lot of legal acts that protecting protected areas already. That is national parks, for example, quite big areas and preservation. So, but I think I would like, in the best of worlds, that the government could just step outside the box and actually give the management of land back to indigenous and local communities. And I think some of the areas we're talking about that is important for us are best managed by those who live off that land. But this is something that most governments struggles. This fear, of course. We did have a talk about it yesterday when we met representatives from the government. It's a fear from the Western society to let go of management, a fear of what will happen in Sweden if we give the Sámi real influence. Is this the dead hand on land, more or less? So I think in Sweden the start is actually talking nation to nation, because we don't do that. It's government to company to indigenous communities, and not the government, the state, nation to nation, for example. So I think we have a long way, but I think those who need to change most is people in majority society, especially authority and governments, and have to learn bias from indigenous communities.
Chris, if I can come to you with the next question, it's from Janine, and she asks or says the building of renewable microgrids is quite expensive still, and she wonders if you can talk about the financial traps of the transition process and I guess some of the barriers that you might encounter.
Yes, I would say that, of course, any new technology, whether it's solar, wind, or even a new television, costs a lot of money. Yeah, it costs. It is expensive. But in most cases, particularly in the clean energy industry world, the reason why commercial investors are investing in large-scale wind and solar and hydrogen projects is because it actually is cheaper than the alternative. It's cheaper than the alternative of coal, not even factoring in the climate effects, but actually, the cost of generate. So I always quote I would like to say he's a good friend of mine, but he's a friend of mine, Saul Griffin, who actually quotes that residential solar from Queensland is the cheapest electricity in the world. It actually outperforms in terms of cost basis, every other source of generation. So although the investment required to actually get it started is high, it has a really quick payback. Then we actually have to think about, well, how can governments or utilities, or even customers, whether they're First Nations or not, actually afford to actually take that initial plunge, to invest in rooftop solar, invest in a battery system, or if it's on a neighborhood by community basis, how does the community actually invest in, the millions of dollars or raise the millions of dollars needed to actually make the switch? So then you have to think about innovative, different ways of approaching finance. Is there a greater role for the global organizations to actually help subsidize, help finance, with lower cost debt, maybe grants and the like, to actually help the vulnerable communities who can't afford to make the switch to be incentivized and be supported to make the switch. And one of the things that I keep pointing out when guys like Saul mentions Queensland, cheapest electricity in the world, but then I will say, yeah, but that's everyone else except for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities who can't afford, one, to own their house, and also to even, stump up the $10,000 required to put a decent size rooftop solar on their own house. So we actually have this, divide in society continuing, that those that can will, those that can't get left behind. So we think about, actually innovative ways to support vulnerable communities and families to actually, be a part of the journey as well.
And as you say, can scarcely afford the cost of diesel with the cost of diesel and things like that going through the roof. It is a difficulty, not just for Aboriginal communities, but for low socioeconomic communities across Australia. It has been a problem in the past, and certainly one that everyone's thinking a lot more about in our cost of living crisis. Jenny, I've got a question here from Ivan, who says, are wind farms less damaging than mines? And how does that kind of development affect reindeer herding?
Well, I think if you look at it just as a windmill farm, of course, it depending on how big and where it's located. If you have a windmill farm located on a mitigation route, it will disturb. But I think when it comes all together in Sweden, which is a lot of smaller country than Australia, we do have a small area. So it's depending on the total pressure from everything and how much the reindeer community has on their land at the moment. Reindeer can adapt to some individual of the reindeer, not necessarily the whole herd, but so it's not a yes or no on that question. It's depending on where it's located and the impacts of it. But we do have a lot of research on windmills and reindeer herding and how it affects. So it's a lot of ongoing research there. So, but any industry or any pressure on pasture land could be neither good or bad. It all comes down to do a good impact assessment and to talk with the community and see their whole situation.
Thank you. Rod, I might throw this next one to you. Tyrone is asking about nuclear, and given that all of what we now call Australia sits on Indigenous land, shouldn't we aim to minimise the land use impacts, and that nuclear has the smallest land use impacts? Should Australia lift the ban on nuclear so we can minimise our land use impact on Indigenous land?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way of looking at it, I guess, in terms of minimising land intensity. But I guess there's a whole lot of other aspects of nuclear power that are a bit more problematic. We still don't really know what to do with the waste. It's very expensive to build. And I think in the Australian context, perhaps most importantly, the Australian energy market is particularly unsuited to nuclear generation. We have very peaky demand, and we have a lot of solar panels and renewable capacity that makes energy very, very cheap, or prices very, very cheap for parts of the day. And nuclear generation is really not very good at turning on and turning off again. So I think I guess perhaps from a land use perspective, and I'd be interested in Indigenous perspectives on that, although the history of nuclear activity in Indigenous Australia is not a happy one. But from a land use perspective, maybe there's an argument there. But I think to bother lifting the ban on nuclear energy development in Australia, I mean, we'd need a fundamentally different energy market with a lot of different energy market rules and other aspects of development to make it all worthwhile. I actually think having the ban there is a good idea because it stops us really having to have serious discussions about a lot of bad ideas.
Chris, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just acknowledge that, what Rod's saying, the nuclear industry in Australia has had a terrible relationship with First Nations community, the worst you could have ever. And I would also like to, having worked on and developed some renewable energy projects alongside First Nations community, even, medium scale projects, none has been large yet. If you involve, the local community, whether they are First Nations or not, in actually some of the planning decisions, to actually put in good land stewardship and good environmental stewardship from the beginning, we can actually end up having, great outcomes. We shouldn't build the wind farm in this location because there's a a flock of protected parrots that live in that area, or there's a grove of, in old growth forest that we don't want to disturb. So we actually make those planning decisions together. But actually locating the windmill just, at 1 kilometre to the north, actually the wind resource is just as good, or nearly as good, or just as good, but actually protects all of those environmental considerations and cultural considerations that are required. Being a former engineer and deep into the numbers, so in 2021 to financial year 2021, Australia needed 266 terawatts of electricity, terawatt hours. By my calculations, using some of these friendly solar developments, where you don't develop every single metre squared of land that you can, but actually leave enough gaps between panels to allow animals to thrive, some of the natural vegetation to actually come up. And then also you can even combine some of these solar panels and wind turbines with actually agricultural land as well. You can still run cattle and sheep and other types of farming ventures. We actually Australia's a very big country. By my calculations, 72.9 kilometres squared of land. So it is 5,000 square kilometres to supply all of our power from solar only. So based on that type of number, it's basically if we build a project outside of Melbourne, it wouldn't even stretch all the way to Ballarat. And all of that land is farmland anyway.
Yeah, food for thought. Jenny, I wonder if I might ask you, if people are leaving this webinar tonight and wanting to think about things that they can do, what's one action that you would encourage people to take or to think about to really help Sámi communities play a role in the green transition instead of being swept along by it or harmed by it, indeed?
Oh, that's quite hard. I think it's just keep talking, and also just the passives is that a few Australian mining companies is mining in Sweden. So maybe give them just to pay respect for rights, respect for each other. That meaning that we also respect, of course, others, but respect and talking and also learning, because we do have a lot to learn from each other, even though we have different system, both on the legal perspective, but also in governance in some ways. But we do have a common agenda in order to save Mother Earth. Save us, more or less, to be able to live on Mother Earth. So think talking and also keep sharing.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Chris, if there's one thing that you would like people to take away from this webinar and be able to take as an action or participate in, whether it's the First Nations Clean Energy Network or other ways to support Indigenous involvement and leading the way on the green energy transition, what would that look like?
So I would encourage everyone to go to our website, and I think we'll send around the link. And if you're interested in staying informed in developments, register. There's a newsletter, mailing list, and all of that type of stuff, so you can stay informed of what's happening. I should also mention that currently the First Nations Clean Energy Network is working with the federal government to design a First Nations Clean Energy strategy. It's a co-design process. It's just kicking off, so we'll be visiting, many towns and cities around the country. So where they are in your region, please join. Also, I'll just take the opportunity before we finish up just to mention the referendum that we're having this year to actually secure, a fair rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in the Constitution, and having our right to, actually consider legislation that affects us, and to make some of those changes that are needed for us to actually be controlled and actually be respected in Australia. So yeah, please follow that as well.
Excellent. So I think that's all really worthwhile reflections. Jenny, in particular, I'm really struck by the fact that Australian mining companies are seeking to operate in Sweden. I definitely know a bunch of activists who would be interested in that, and to hear that. And Chris, again, thank you for your time. And yeah, definitely encourage people, check out the First Nations Clean Energy Network online. And once again, please urge everyone to check out what you can do to support the referendum later in the year for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. I'll thank my 3 panellists tonight and all of you for joining us. But thank you, Rod Campbell, Jenny Witt-Karlsson, all the way from Sweden, and Chris Croker for your time this evening. We really appreciate it. This episode was recorded live on Wednesday the 15th of March 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today at australiainstitute.org.au. That's also where you'll find all our latest research and content, and you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a ~N~T. Jenny is at Wick Karlsson, that's WIKKARLSSON. Rod Cameron is at R_O_D_C. And our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, and with special thanks to Nordic Talks. Thanks for listening.